How's it going, folks? We will be covering Mexico, the early colonial period in this presentation. As stated in the previous lecture, the Spanish War with the Mexica in August 1521 signaled the defeat of Mexico Tenochtitlan. However, this did not translate into the conquest of the entire region we refer to as Mexico today. Indigenous groups in western and northern Mexico, such as the Purépecha, the Cocas, the Cuejes, Zacatecos, and the Pueblos, were certainly not under Spanish rule by then. These groups also fought in a series of massive uprisings, such as the Mixton War, the Chichimeca Wars, and the Pueblo Revolt, to name a few. Enslaved Africans were also not compliant to their marginal status. There were also runaway African slave communities known as marrones, as well as palenques. And one of the earliest of these was San Lorenzo de los Negros by present-day Veracruz, which was then led by Yanga. And by the way, I made a short video on Yanga. If you would like to learn more, I will link it below. I won't be listing all the major uprisings, laws, wars, and events in this colonial Mexican period crash course. Instead, I will provide a broad sketch of the institutions, the structures, and the customs that characterize the colonial Spanish rule in Mexico during the 16th and 17th centuries. And this was, of course, when the Habsburg crown of Spain was in power. Unfortunately, I can't go into depth with the historical details, but I will provide resources for further reading in the conclusion and description of this video. So how were these newly conquered Mexican territories administered? After the conquest of the Mexica, the capital city of Tenochtitlan was rebranded as Mexico City. The former Mexica territories became an extension of the Spanish Empire known as the Kingdom of New Spain. Over time, New Spain would include most of what is now considered Mexico, Central America, parts of South America, and the Philippines. New Spain was also broken up into provinces such as Nueva Galicia, Nueva Vizcaya, and Nuevo Santander, among others. Economically, this relationship between Spain and New Spain is described as mercantilism. In this system, the colonies provided wealth and resources to the mother country, which consequently, over time, impoverished the people living in New Spain over time. The Habsburg dynasty directly benefited from this relationship. They were entitled to receiving the royal fifth, or quinto, which referred to a fifth of all profits that their Spanish subjects made in New Spain from selling precious metals. However, the crown's mismanagement of the money that it made from gold and silver eventually backfired in that it led to inflation. What about ruling over the colonies? The Habsburg king, who could not physically be present in the Spanish colonies, appointed a representative to rule in his place, known as the Viceroy. There was also a legislative body for New Spain known as the Audiencia. The members of the Audiencia served as judges who carried out executive and legal functions. The Audiencia was broken up into various jurisdictions or districts that were administered by officials known as corregidores, alcaldes mayores, and gobernadores, for example. What about indigenous governors under Spanish rule? I'm going to be returning to this topic shortly. But if you would like to learn more about these positions and their functions, I highly recommend Alejandro Cañeque's book, The King's Living Image. What were the general problems and inefficiencies of Habsburg rule in New Spain? For starters, corruption was rampant. Indigenous communities often correctly complained that they were being overtaxed by Spanish officials. There were also numerous complaints that the same officials took bribes, and offices that were supposed to be awarded by an election or appointment basis were eventually given up to the highest bidder. The practice of selling offices was so normalized that it eventually became accepted as a method of determining who was the most interested in the position in question. Moreover, whilst the Spanish settlers and conquistadors claimed loyalty to the Spanish crown, they also exercised what I refer to jokingly as a cult of not following orders. The common saying, obedezco pero no cumplo, I obey but I do not comply, reflected much of the apathy and ambivalence many Spanish officials expressed towards the new orders sent from the crown, as well as from the viceroy. In part, the reason Spanish officials often ignored these orders was also due to inefficiencies in communication, which was a problem that became even more pronounced as the Spanish Empire extended north and south. So now we have a general idea of the political dynamics in New Spain. What about the social order and hierarchy that kept indigenous people in a subservient position to the Spanish? People in colonial Mexican society, as they were in other parts of Spanish-occupied Latin America, were ordered according to the caste system or sistema de castas. What caste one was part of depended on their skin color, their complexion, and in some cases, their level of acculturation. The caste system allowed the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church to determine how to tax and demand tribute from those in the lower social racial categories. This system typically favored people who were lighter skinned and who came from Spanish background. People born in Spain, known as Peninsulares, and Spaniards born in the Americas, known as Criollos, were the only two castes who were allowed to the high government positions, such as viceroys, members of the audiencia, and corregidores. And while people of African or indigenous ancestry or dark skin were perceived as inferior, and thus they were prohibited from taking prestigious governing positions in the Spanish colonies. In short, whiteness meant more social and political opportunities in New Spain, while darker features implied poverty and less opportunity. Sadly, the legacies of racism and colorism in Latin America today can be traced to the caste system. The historical legacies of caste and race might shed light also on discussions about how anti-Blackness, discrimination of darker-skinned peoples, and anti-Asian hate continue to permeate in the Chicanx and Latinx communities. There were an absurd number of casta categories as evident in the famous casta paintings, but the categories of Peninsular, Criollo, Mestizo, Indio, and Negro appear to have had outlasted the others. Within the casta hierarchy, the most powerful group were the Spaniards, or Peninsulares, also known as Cachupines, which referred to people born in Spain and sent across the Atlantic to rule over the colony. Below the Peninsulares were the Criollos, or Creoles, which referred to people born from Spanish parents and born in Mexico. Mestizos, or quote, mixed peoples, referred to those who had both Spanish and indigenous parents. There were also mulattos, or people with Spanish and African parents, although sometimes this category was also used to refer to people born of Black and indigenous parents. Both mestizos and mulattos were looked down upon by both the Spaniards and the Criollos, who held the racist belief that people of pure European background were superior to everyone else. At the bottom were the Indios, meaning Indians, which of course referred to indigenous peoples. Indios were often forced to work as laborers in the encomienda and repartimiento labor system. There were also Indios Chinos, which referred to enslaved Filipino slaves brought to Mexico. And notably, as a side note, the use of the term Chino as a blanket term to refer to all Asian peoples in colonial Mexico speaks to the historic, racist, and problematic inclination by some in Latin America to describe all API peoples as simply Chinos. Anyways, that's the end of that side rant. And at the very bottom of this hierarchy were Africans who were regarded as negros, and they were often brought to New Spain as slaves. Granted, you do have some cases of freed and emancipated former African slaves in New Spain as well. So, in short, the caste system operated as a hierarchy that implied that groups who were at the very bottom were degenerate. Even those part of the white Criollo caste were not spared from the discriminatory nature of these pseudoscientific categories. Back in Europe, various intellectuals such as Cornelius de Paul propagated the pseudoscientific belief that Europeans born in the Americas were inferior to those born in Europe. Some argued that because the Creoles lived in a land with a hotter, tropical, and therefore inferior climate, they in turn became inferior just like the natives who lived there. In contrast, Europeans who were brought up in Europe's cold, moist, and quote, superior climate were thus more superior. And some would also argue that the criollos and peninsulares living in the Americas contributed to their own degeneracy by eating inferior foods that were native to the Americas. Juan Lopez de Cancelada, a creolophobe, or I should say criollophobe, further argued that, quote, nature conspired with nurture to produce a feckless Creole elite, seigneurs with white hands who were reared to think of themselves as gentlemen and were generally unfit for any trade or form of productive work. In response to this rhetoric, Criollo patriots living in New Spain like Francisco Javier Clavijero responded with a literature of their own, arguing that their upbringing in the Americas made them no different from the Peninsulares. Some Criollos, perhaps ironically, argued that pre-Hispanic indigenous civilizations in Mexico and South America, such as the Mexica, Toltecs, and Incas, were on par with the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations. Now, returning to the caste system, it's important to note that these caste hierarchies were not static. By the 17th century, many of the caste categories began to erode. You were either considered a Spanish peninsular, a criollo, Indian, or mestizo. In many cases, it appeared that one's complexion and their ability to pass as another caste mattered in colonial New Spain. For example, indigenous peoples perceived as having lighter skin could pass as mestizos, which sometimes gave them better socio-economic opportunities. Consequently, terms like indio, negro, and mulatto came to have derogatory connotations. Indeed, today the term indio is still considered a derogatory and pejorative phrase for indigenous peoples throughout Mexico. And as a side note, the preferred term now is indígena, which means indigenous person. So how were indigenous communities impacted and reorganized under Spanish rule? The fate of various conquered indigenous groups was their forced relocation to newer, more concentrated communities, known as congregaciones and sometimes also called reducciones. The purpose of setting up these new congregaciones was to allow for easier administration of indigenous subjects. The Spanish crown could now more easily rule, tax, and convert them to Christianity. This resolved the problem of administering sparsely populated indigenous populations. This also aided the Spanish crown in its goal to establish separate Indian republics, or República de Indios, where in theory they could live independently from Spanish rule. This setup, of course, did not pan out in practice, as Spaniards, mestizos, and people of other ethnic categories or castes made their way into these communities. Indigenous people were also relocated to new frontier communities such as presidios and missions. The Spaniards used these outposts as part of an effort to colonize regions that were not yet formally conquered by the Spanish or were not adequately populated with Spanish subjects. A problem with most of these fortified frontier communities was that the indigenous peoples, mestizos, and sometimes Catholic missionaries who were relocated there lived in what essentially served as a buffer zone between conquered Spanish territories and unconquered Spanish territories. As Borderlands historians point out, the northern frontier regions were often subject to attacks by indigenous enemies such as the Apaches and Comanches, who were sometimes given firearms, horses, and other supplies by French, British, and US American traders. As both Juliana Barr and Pekka Hämäläinen point out in their works, the Spanish borderlands to the north were areas where Spaniards were never really able to establish true dominance. For that matter, the Spanish often settled disputes on the Apaches and Comanches terms, and even found themselves paying tribute to them. In times of unrest and warfare, the presidios, missions, and frontier communities were usually the first to suffer. In the frontiers of Nueva Galicia, Zacatecas, and Texas, for example, the indigenous and mestizo populations sent to live there in the Spanish borderlands were often those who made up some of the largest number of casualties and deaths during assaults and raids. So how did the Spanish govern indigenous communities under their rule in colonial Mexico? So those groups who were loyal to the Spanish crown were often granted a loose sense of political autonomy. However, they were expected to pay the Spanish with excessive tribute and laborers under the system known as the encomienda. The purpose of encomiendas was to reward Spaniards who participated in the conquests of the Americas with land and indigenous servants. Unsurprisingly, this led to conflicts with native elites. The Spaniards awarded land and laborers were known as encomenderos. They oversaw lands given to them, which were of course often stolen from an indigenous village, region, or district. Encomenderos did not only include former conquistadors, but also their descendants. They held conquered indigenous groups to labor for them in their fields and homes known as haciendas. In exchange for tribute, the encomenderos were expected to protect the indigenous people that they held in their encomienda. They were also responsible for converting them to Christianity. However, numerous legal complaints from indigenous authorities throughout the early colonial period demonstrate that encomenderos had rarely recognized many of these expectations. Wealthier encomenderos took advantage of native laborers, ordering them to work their sugar mills and mines. These were some of the most dangerous jobs. Injuries, disease, death, and overwork were common in these conditions. Sometimes indigenous peoples worked alongside enslaved Africans brought across the Atlantic. And to learn more on this, there is a chapter on this subject in the edited collection Beyond Black and Red, African-Native Relations in Colonial Latin America. Sometimes indigenous peoples might also work alongside enslaved Filipinos brought from the port of Acapulco via the Manila galleon. Perhaps not surprisingly, the encomienda system was ripe with abuses. Natives, Catholic missionaries, and mestizos and Spaniards alike complained that this system exploited indigenous peoples. This led the encomienda to later become refashioned and repurposed into the repartimiento system, which was supposed to ease the abuses of the encomienda, but ultimately did not succeed in stopping the abuse of labor exploitation. Both the encomienda and repartimiento systems furthered the decimation of native populations. Many of the exploited repartimiento laborers continued to die from overwork and disease, which were also known as cocolisli, or disease outbreaks. The repartimiento also contributed to the desertion of villages as various native groups chose to abandon their communities so that they would not have to work or be forced to work for the encomenderos. So what benefits did loyalty to the Kingdom of New Spain provide for indigenous rulers and elites? Indigenous rulers of entire villages or provinces were recognized as chiefs, known as caciques. Notably, cacique was a word that originated from the indigenous Taino populations decimated by the Spanish. Some indigenous elites who received the title of gobernador were appointed to administer larger regions such as the province of Michoacán in center-west Mexico. The nobles or indigenous elites with other administrative duties beneath the gobernador or cacique were recognized as principales. These caciques were not only in charge of collecting tribute for the Spanish crown, they could also use their authority to demand tribute from the commoners or macehuales, which referred to the common people who were not part of the indigenous nobility. Caciques recognized by the viceroy could also obtain some practical benefits. Caciques and indigenous nobles could be excused from participating in the repartimiento. They were also allowed to do things that, by law, indigenous peoples were not allowed to do, such as wearing Spanish clothing, carrying a sword, or riding a horse. Some caciques loyal to the Spanish crown managed to accumulate sizable wealth. One example is Don Antonio Huitzimengari from Michoacán, who was the last son of the Tarascan or Purepecha ruler, the Casonsi. Don Antonio used his wealth to build roads and fund public works projects. Don Antonio also financially assisted the viceroy's armies during the Chichimeca wars in Zacatecas. Over time, however, many caciques lost such privileges and power in the early colonial period due to complaints of abuse of power from the macehuales and also, perhaps ironically, due to complaints of abuse of power from Spanish officials. What about the role of the Catholic Church and Catholic missionaries in facilitating what is often referred to as the spiritual conquest of Mexico? The spiritual conquest of Mexico is an umbrella term used to describe the various events that led to the mass conversion of indigenous peoples in Mexico to Catholicism. The spiritual conquest, however, was complicated. Although Catholic priests, bishops, and missionaries all played key roles in converting natives to Catholicism, these groups did not always see eye to eye. In many respects, the Catholic Church saw the Catholic missionaries in New Spain as competitors. Some religious authorities literally got into fistfights and committed arson against rival monasteries, sometimes setting them on fire, and you can read more about this in Martin Austin Nesvig's book, Promiscuous Power. Notably, it was the Catholic missionaries, not officials from the Catholic Church, who first initiated conversion efforts in what would become Mexico, or New Spain. These missionaries were part of distinct mendicant orders who came to New Spain to convert natives to Christianity. The most common mendicant orders in New Spain were the Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and Jesuits. Some historians describe them as, quote, pioneer missionaries, because on the one hand, they lived among the newly converted indigenous populations and thus spearheaded conversion and acculturation efforts. On the other hand, these missionaries tended to live in places that the Spanish claimed to have dominion over, but did not really populate. So sometimes these missionaries lived in very remote areas and, if lucky, might perhaps be given a few Spanish soldiers to protect them. These missionaries took a vow of poverty and simplicity, which seems to have been admired by some indigenous groups or populations who received them and perhaps compared them to their own priests who had similar customs. They also established ties with native and mestizo populations by creating cofradías or confraternities, which were associations that had organized celebrations for Catholic saints as well as Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary. And perhaps best stated by Alan Knight, these missionaries were the, quote, shock troops of the spiritual conquest and surprising even themselves by what they thought were their successes. However, religious conversion was a complicated process. While many natives seemed open to converting to Catholicism, contemporary observers noted how sometimes they continued to worship their traditional deities alongside their Catholic deities. Religious syncretism was certainly at play, as many Spaniards complained that sometimes the natives associated many of the Catholic religious figures as manifestations of their own deities. So, for example, Tonantzin and Coatlicue became associated with the Virgin Mary, Quetzalcoatl was associated with St. Thomas, and the Zapotec rain god Cosijo became associated with St. Peter. On the larger scale, Catholicism in Mexico blended Spanish and indigenous religious practices. Today, for example, some Catholic churches in Mexico and some Catholic churches in the US with large Mexican-American congregations will still use copal incense, which was also used by many Central Mexican indigenous groups for their own ceremonial practices. Days of the Dead celebrations are also a contemporary example of such religious syncretism, but I am getting ahead of myself, so feel free to check out Google Scholar for works that touch on these subjects. What about the Catholic Church as an institution in Mexico? To solidify their power and authority over the missionaries and mendicant orders in New Spain, they established a church hierarchy in New Spain complete with bishops and priests who are often referred to as the secular clergy. In contrast, missionaries are referred to as the regular clergy. The agents of the Catholic Church also brought the notorious Holy Office of the Inquisition to New Spain in order to combat acts of heresy. Notably, indigenous peoples were excluded from the Inquisition in 1571 on the grounds that they were of, quote, rude character and incapacity. Clerical authorities often described indigenous people as if they were children who did not know any better. Thus, according to this rationale, the natives should not be tried by the Inquisition for their idolatries because, due to their immaturity, they were easily enticed by the devil to worship idols. Some of the early Catholic churches in central and western Mexico physically and symbolically championed the spiritual conquest of native religions by constructing their churches atop of destroyed indigenous temples. And as a side note, this was something that the Catholic Church also did with mosques in Spain after the Reconquista. Today, tourists can still see the remnants of ancient temples in some of these older churches, such as those found in Mexico City and in Pátzcuaro in Michoacán. Sadly, perhaps one of the most disastrous policies that led to the erasure of many pre-Hispanic histories was the Catholic Church's censorship and book burning campaigns. In the mid-16th century, the Church ordered the burning of any text they considered to be blasphemous or potentially idolatrous. As a result, clerical authorities confiscated hundreds of pre-Hispanic texts belonging to groups such as the Nahuas, Maya, and Mixtecs, and ordered these ancient texts to be burned en masse. Perhaps the most important figure to facilitate the spiritual conquest of New Spain was the Virgin of Guadalupe. On 1531, it is said that the Virgin Mary appeared to a newly converted indigenous convert named Juan Diego on the hill of Tepeyac. According to this legend, the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared with dark skin and indigenous features. She spoke to Juan Diego in Nahuatl and commanded him to build a church in her honor. The legend became popularized in the mid-17th century and was soon embraced by indigenous peoples, mestizos, and even criollos. During the early colonial period, various Catholic missionaries and officials did express sympathy to the plight of indigenous peoples. Famously, there was Bartolomé de las Casas, a former encomendero who is remembered as a defender of indigenous peoples. His protests were partly responsible for ending the encomienda system in favor of the repartimiento. He wrote a text known in English as A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, where he criticized the Spaniards' ill treatment of natives throughout the Americas. Another renowned Catholic figure was the first bishop of Michoacán, Vasco de Quiroga, who championed the creation of self-sufficient and autonomous villages for indigenous peoples, which he referred to as hospitales or hospitals. Nuns like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz also questioned injustices committed against Mexico's indigenous populations, but more famously, she also actively used her poems and writings to challenge patriarchal customs as well as prevailing religious and pseudoscientific ideas about female inferiority that were prevalent at the time. Some feminists today consider her to be the first American feminist. So thank you. That is all for what I had hoped to be a short crash course video. It ended up being longer than I anticipated. In a future video, I will cover the later colonial period, beginning with the end of Habsburg rule in New Spain and beginning with the Bourbon dynasty. For now, I leave you with this list of additional recommended reading that are referenced in this video. And so for those of you who are watching on YouTube, I will also provide this list in the description below. Take care and see you in the next one.